Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Cultural Studies podcast. My name is Toby Miller, and my guest today is.
Hi, I'm Joseph Maguire, Professor Emeritus at Loughborough University and past president of the International Sociology of Sport Association.
Indeed, you are, old thing, and it's really great to see you. It's been a long time since we've actually been together in the same room, but your work is with me all the time, as are happy memories of time spent together. So, what I
No, absolutely. And it's although we're not in the same room together, a virtual room allows us to have the conversation, which I'm sure we'll enjoy during the next wee while.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. So I wanted to begin by asking you, in a sense, what's going on for you now? What are you thinking about? What's troubling you? What's interesting you? What's happening?
In terms of everyday things, of course, you look around and you can't help but see to what degree there is a turmoil at work, and we live in unsettling times. I sometimes think if we look back in time, whether the antecedents of cataclysmic events were evident to people in the 30s and whether that actually has any parallels to what is at work in the present day. So I try to keep abreast of those things, but also try to contain them because, of course, to what degree you have any influence or power to influence the course of events and to what impact that has on your own personal well-being. So that's one side of, I guess, what I'm thinking about and feeling at the present time. And the other one is one which is much more in my control. Having retired full time from the work at the university, I still continue to do various teaching in different places, but my own research is what gives me great pleasure.
Mm.
And that research links to issues about my own biography and identity, and it explores the 20th century relationship between the Irish and British and how and in what ways that's manifested itself in the context of the world of sport. And more specifically, how, in what ways could, should, or would sport play a role in the build up to a border poll in terms of reunification of Ireland
Mm, mm.
and what a new Ireland might look like if the vote went in favor of reunification. And the sort of research I'm doing with regard to that is both developmental, which reflects, and I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about this, my own theoretical framework, but also the more involved self about biography and migration in terms of the contemporary aspects and how and in what ways we can influence um, key decision makers, either in the political sphere or in the sportive sphere, with regard to those sort of questions.
I wonder if I could ask you to give some context for listeners who may not be aware of it, of the island of Ireland. And I know this is a massive and lengthy history, but just to explain for those who may not be aware, Northern Ireland, Republic of Ireland, the relationship, British imperialism and colonialism, and so on.
Well, I will, and but by segue, I should actually say, despite the accent, I'm born in Ireland. My father served in the military from 39 to 57 in the Irish Defence Forces, and my ancestors would have fought in the War of Independence, which would have been in the late 1919 to 21, 22 period. Um, so that's the personal background
Mm.
and why I'm invested and involved in it. But in terms of what cultural studies people will be aware of is the very popular concept of settler colonialism. And the history of Ireland and its relationship to Great Britain is the history of settler colonialism. That is, for the last 800 years, different ethnic groups have sought to invade and conquer and settle Ireland. It was most successful in the context of the north of Ireland, and in particular from the 1600s onwards, you had what in Irish terms we call plantations in the north of Ireland, in the province of Ulster, one of four provinces which make up the whole island of Ireland. Having said that, to jump forward several centuries, the settlement where part of the island of Ireland got independence, forming the Irish Free State and then eventually the Republic of Ireland, 6 of the 9 counties of Ulster became Northern Ireland. And why 6 of the 9 counties? Because it was to ensure that the plantation settlers who were of a Protestant, Scottish, and English background would maintain their artificial majority relative to the minority Catholic indigenous Celtic people. And that runs through the last 100 years of the relationship between the formation of Northern Ireland as a statelet and its relationship to Great Britain, and the development of the Irish Free State into the Republic of Ireland. I should say that, of course, that there are people who are of English ethnic background and people of a different religious persuasion, whether they're Protestant or non-Christian, live on the island of Ireland and live in the Republic of Ireland. And so the extent to which it is simply a Catholic Protestant is much more complex than that.
And in terms of your own biography, you mentioned your father's military service and so on. If we could get on to how you're dealing with that issue in your current thinking, research, writing, the interrelationship between your upbringing and life, the complex history that you've just explained, and sports-related topics.
I can certainly do that, Toby. I guess if we go back in time, for those of you either more or less familiar with my research, of course, I'm known for work which I've done on globalization and sport, and in particular aspects of whether it's political economy, national identity, or migration. And of course, other scholars make the case much better than I that, of course, what we study is personal. And to make sense of my own experiences growing up in Ireland and then moving to England, to make sense of that, of course, you start to explore issues of migration and of identity and of the local and the global. No surprise then that work in the past I've done have been on the Empire Games, the Empire Strikes Back, on the whole flows of migration. And as a result of which, that it has always informed what I've done to a greater or lesser degree. In the contemporary context, I guess I feel like not a cultural cadre or a cultural intermediary, but certainly as someone who is both involved in the notion of reunification of the island of Ireland and seeing how and in what ways some of the relatively detached work I do can provide evidence-based policy in order to move it in that direction.
And what do you see as being the prospects for reunification? A lot of people saw Brexit as a possible entree to reunification, because many people in Northern Ireland would see that throwing in their lot yet again with the British would be undesirable. It's clear that the current settlement, in terms of European Union norms, Republic of Ireland norms, British norms, is not really working. And it's very clear that Northern Ireland remains immensely dependent on Britain, the rest of Britain, for money, and particularly people near the border rely very heavily on the Republic of Ireland for trade, and to a certain extent vice versa. Can you see some prospect of reunification?
Brexit certainly added a boost or extra fuel to a longer term trend. And the longer term trend is the changing demography of the North, so that those who are viewed as nationalist, Republican, Catholic. That grouping has enlarged over time. And as the civil rights movement of the 60s developed through the Troubles into the modern period of the present day, you can see that they have grown, in a sense, a greater sense of confidence with their group charisma. They feel like they can actually hold on to their own language, their own identity, and can seek reunification. That's on the one side. On the other side, the longer term trend is also that, well, we all die away. And some of the more hardline traditional groups, which held hegemonic control in the North for a long period of time, have had to come to terms with the changing balance of power. Hence why you've got a peace process, but it's a frozen peace. Where at the present time, the different groups seek, of course, to win-lose. They win, the other side will lose. As to answer your question more directly, not in this decade, but the process is unfolding. Indeed, the most recent research over, coincidentally, the last few days from the ARANS project, that's the Royal Academy for Irish Research, and that project shows that there is a general trend towards both Catholics wanting reunification in higher and greater numbers, and a smaller but growing proportion of Protestant unionist loyalists who want that reunification. But at the present time, if you were to have if we can go by opinion polls and so forth, today there would probably not be a majority in the North for reunification. Interestingly enough, and this might link to questions of different cultures, different societies, around 20% of that group who don't wish for reunification to take place would be deeply unhappy and wouldn't accept the outcome. So, of course, then that has the potential for armed conflict re-emerging on the island of Ireland.
And again, just to give a bit of context, so the expression unionist loyalist, that means people who are mostly Protestant, often Presbyterian, who identify very much with being part of the United Kingdom, so-called, or Great Britain, and that's what it refers to. It's very interesting that the word loyal gets used in so ideological a fashion to exclude others. And as you say, although it's not absolute, there is a certain amount of religious bifurcation, Catholic, Protestant, that's relevant to this. And that has had all sorts of class implications as well over time in terms of job opportunities, wealth, and power for minority Catholics.
Absolutely. And indeed, of course, the reason why it's important to distinguish and for listeners to understand the distinction between unionism and loyalism. Unionism tends to be upper middle class in professional occupations, still highly gendered, whereas loyalism tends to be working class and tends to be more associated with British identity and loyalty to the crown. Yeah. Whereas the bourgeois groupings tend to actually, interestingly enough, not only want to hold on to their British passport, this is a good lesson in Brexit, also have taken out Irish passports to a greater degree than ever before. They want, if you like, their cake and eat it. It manifests itself in sport in a very complex way. Just to give you two very quick examples. One, this weekend, Ireland will be playing against Scotland in the Six Nations in rugby union, in the men's Six Nations Championship. They played last weekend against England, and I have to say I was delighted to see that they won. So they're playing fellow Celts tomorrow, but they play it as Ireland. That is the island of Ireland. So one team represents the whole. Whereas if you take association football or soccer, what you find is that there are two national associations, one for Northern Ireland and one for the Republic of Ireland. Crucially, rugby union, whether it's in the male or female versions of the sport, tends to be more bourgeois and upper class and taught in private schools in the north of Ireland. Whereas association football or soccer is a much more working class sport, and the split between those two associations occurred prior to the separation of the states into Northern Ireland and the Irish Free State. So as a result of which, you get two teams, and you get the loyalist working class who strongly associate and seek to retain control of soccer or association football as emblematic of their identity.
It's incredibly interesting, isn't it? And even during the Troubles, Ireland was united in rugby. I mean, often there would only be one Northern Ireland player in the team or the squad, probably, right? But he would be there in that men's team. How did that arise? How was that, and how was it sustained?
Well, and crucially, of course, he wouldn't be, or she wouldn't be, but in those days of the Troubles, before women rugby players really gained prominence, they now have both men's and women's forms of the sport. They would, of course, crucially have been from the province of Ulster, and which Northern Ireland is only made up of 6 of those 9 counties. So you would find that if you were from the north, from Northern Ireland, you would be competing in the national team. Interestingly enough, though, Toby, and indeed you could see it in those listeners who would want to go on YouTube, go to last weekend's match between Ireland and England in Dublin. And as the camera pans along the line, they'll notice 2 things. One, that the first anthem, which is sung by the team, is called Aran Naveen, which is Gaelic, and it is about the soldier's song. You can understand the theme. The second one is called Ireland's Call, which is sung in English. But as you pan along the line, you'll notice some players are singing one of the anthems and some are not, and vice versa. And overwhelmingly, Aran Naveen, if you're from Ulster, you're probably Protestant Unionist, and you won't be singing that national anthem. How was it managed over time? Until the late 1950s, the sport of rugby union in and on the island of Ireland tended to reflect a Protestant Unionist background. And over the course of the 60s and onwards, the provinces of Leinster, Munster, which is where I'm from, and Connaught in the west, which is a much more Gaelic-speaking part of the island, their rugby developed more and more, and did so in competition to traditional Gaelic sports, but gained more and more prominence. And the national sport was moved to Dublin. And it was managed carefully during the Troubles in order to finesse that relationship, in order for it to be sustained. And of course, if you look at the iconography of the team, they wear green, of course, but they wear a shamrock. So the icon and the flag of the national team is not the tricolour, which we could come on to as to what its symbolism might be, because it's green, white, and orange, but actually is the 4 provinces' flags. So it's a composite again. It's a way in which you find a reconciliation or an accommodation to see what is a divided society. But we often used to say, didn't we not, about South Africa and sport, you can't have normal sport in an abnormal society. And similarly so, these accommodations are ways in which you can't have normal sport within an abnormal society.
And Prof. Joe, I wonder if we could move on to this question of orange, that color that you've just alluded to. It's so incredibly important it is inflammatory in many ways for Catholic folks in the North. Can you explain a little bit about its history and its symbolism?
So we go back in time, of course, as I mentioned, to the settler colonialism. And I know North Americans are much more familiar with this debate with regard to how Europeans, of course, would have come to North America, as we call it, whether it was to Mexico earlier with the Spanish and Portuguese and South America, and then, of course, Europeans to the both what we call United States of America and Canada. But the settler colonialism actually had a dramatic impact on the island of Ireland because, one, it was about language. Two, it was about the control of the land and dispossession. And three, it was about religious identity or religious practices. And in each of these cases, the plantation movements, the settler colonialism, which came from Great Britain into and onto the island of Ireland, brought with it a diminution of the language of Gaeilge, number one. So I'm speaking to you in English. I'm not speaking to you in Gaeilge. Number two, of course, it was the dispossession of land. My family came from the county of Fermanagh, which is in Ulster. And, well, through its period of history, before the island was ever a united nation, it would be made up of different kingdoms, and there would have been a kingdom of Maguires, or, of course, Maguire, as I spell it today to you, and others read it, is not my spelling. Actually, I am Maguire. So it's two separate parts, the son of Uhia. And then, of course, if you see how and in what ways the Protestant ascendancy grew in power, orange is the denomination here. So it was a different form of Christianity. We don't have to replay the Reformation, the Counter-Reformation, and how and in what ways both Christian groupings dealt with each other in such terrible ways. But the ascendancy in the North in particular was the development of particular types of Protestantism. So the schismatic tendencies of Protestantism developed in the north of Scotland, in particular, through a form of Presbyterianism. It wasn't the Church of England, it wasn't Anglican, which kept with it some of its bells and smells. Rather, the Presbyterian was much more austere, very much strictly interpreting a rendition of what the King James Bible actually would say. And the Orange Order was a group which developed, which would seek to proselytize, which would seek to police the boundaries, not only of their own religion, but also of the chances and life chances of different people, for better or for worse. And if you were Catholic and nationalist, it would be always for the worst. And so major occupational groups, whether it was teachers, whether it was lawyers, doctors, or whether it was manual work in the shipyards of Belfast, in each of these areas, the Orange Order and the Presbyterian ascendancy would ensure that Catholics would be in a minority and would get access in a very restricted way. And that's why, for those of you in North America, in the United States in particular, the echoes of the civil rights movements, which you saw Martin Luther King leading and others, of course, had its parallel in the mid to late 60s in Ireland, and in particular in the north of Ireland, in terms of restrictions over voting rights, in terms of restrictions with regard to access to employment and education. And of course, the university in the north at Belfast is Queen's University. The name gives the game away, folks. Right. And so as a result of which, those civil rights movements gave an empowerment to the minority. And then, of course, the armed conflict begins, where you have a loyalist backlash against those who are marching for their rights, a bit like Selma, because on the road from Derry to Belfast, civil rights movements were also ambushed by similar folk who were resisting the tide of change and the arc of change.
Now, Prof, you've given us a wonderful historical panorama, and I think that's a way into considering your scholarly contributions since really the mid to late 80s, over all that time, where history and sociological theory have intersected in ways that are really quite unusual, I think, at the depth of which one and the other interpenetrate. And especially true in the case of the sports sciences and all the other terms that are used that are synonymous with it. So I wonder if you could take us on a bit of a tour of your thinking and the influences upon you and your work. I know that's a lot to do, but go for it.
Well, you carbon dated me somewhat, didn't you? Back to the 70s. But it was in 1975 as a young Irish guy living in England and actually ending up at University of London and excuse me. And there I was studying history, education, and what we would call sports studies, I guess, these days, sports science. It becomes names have different formats and so forth, kinesiological studies. But it was in that period of time, in the mid 70s, the history I was being taught was by and large Marxist social history, number one. Two, the education courses which would be underway was influenced by what was called the new sociology of education. And the new sociology of education again reflected that move to the left and moved to humanistic Marxism, away from structural determinism. And you can see, of course, Toby, the roots through from there to what Stuart Hall and others at Birmingham would develop into cultural studies and different forms of Marxist scholarship out of Birmingham. I should say, by the way, and flag it up, I grew up in part in Birmingham. And in addition to which, one of the most famous Irish singers who becomes a member of the Dubliners, some of you might know the folk band or listen to it, but a man called Luke Kelly, who was another Irish immigrant, and he ends up in Birmingham. And he's taken under the wing of a classicist at the University of Birmingham, who introduces him to various Marxist social theory. And he has the opportunity, after a period of time and listening to English folk music, as to whether he will continue his journey to Prague. And of course, in that period, Prague, for those younger listeners, that was behind the Iron Curtain. But Luke Kelly goes back to Dublin and he meets various others who actually say a little less of the English folk music and more of the Irish ballad, please. And of course, then we see the development of the Dubliners, and they are part of to overstate it slightly, a cultural Gaelic Celtic renaissance at work. Irish people become more confident in listening to and speaking their own language, their own culture, and their own cultural memories. But to go back to my time, you also found that the two strands were this Marxist social history, and in addition to which, phenomenology, symbolic interactionism, was also part and parcel of that cultural sphere. You notice at this point, I haven't said anything or any connection to what I've eventually become associated with, which is process or figurational sociology, or the work of Norbert Elias. Probably the nearest to it was a man called Basil Bernstein and his work on class, culture, and control, which had Bernstein and Elias, Norbert Elias or Elias, had connections in that period of time. I finished my degree, so I'm already thinking historically, but also sociologically. And, people put labels on you over the course of your career, and maybe you do yourself. I don't know whether I'm a sociological historian or a historical sociologist. whichever it is, I always see that in order to understand the present, you've got to see how it emerges out of the past, and that today is also a process, and it's interconnected and interdependent. Hence why in another book I wrote, I made connections with Howard Becker back into that tradition. And of course, Becker's work on art worlds was very much about these interconnections and interdependence. So where do I end up? No master plan, Toby. I ended up at Leicester University, where I started my PhD in sociology department, under the supervision in the British system, under the single supervision of Eric Dunning, who very much was influenced by process or figurational sociology, and he had been a co-writer with Norbert Elias on various work. Should point out, by the way, is that people link Eric Dunning only with that and with the study of sport. But actually, as a younger man, not only had he studied in the United States, he'd married a Black American, and his early work was on racism. He was a contemporary of John Rex, for those of you familiar with that sort of tradition within the sociology of race and race relations in the United Kingdom. Anyway, I digress, only to say is that what we were interested in was a sociological problem, which was also a social problem, and that was the study of football hooliganism in that period of time. So for better and for worse, I think, but any of your listeners can check this, I may well have the first PhD in the study of football hooliganism.
And I just interrupt for a second to give some context to folks to this. One is there was this perceived massive problem with football at that time in Britain. And two, that Leicester became, in a sense, the center of scholarly investigation and knowledge about this. Like, just to throw that in.
Yes, and indeed, Leicester, as you know, Toby, was probably pre-LSE, pre-Cambridge, not pre-Cambrian, pre-Cambridge, was regarded as preeminent in the sociology departments in Britain. For the 60s and 70s, it was the place to go, before Essex, before the LSE, which of course LSE had a London School of Economics had a different portfolio. But if you wanted to study sociology, Leicester was the place to go. I mean, it had people like Tony Giddens and many others who were at Leicester in that period as a young lecturer. However, the other thing I should add is that I was fortunate. I had a funded PhD from the government, from the Social Science Research Council, SSRC. And it was one of the last years you could have a PhD studentship from the Social Science Research Council. Why? Because in 1979, when I started my PhD, Mrs. Thatcher came to power. And what her ideological disposition was, and think of the parallels with the United States today, her mission was that she thought there was no such thing as society and that you couldn't study such a thing scientifically. And so she appointed various people to effectively find a way to close sociology departments. And they were less successful than they wanted to be, but they changed the funding body from the Social Science Research Council to the Economic and Social Research Council. Notice, of course, the key change of terms. And so I was one of the last studentships for an SSRC. I thought to myself as I began and ended my PhD that I couldn't study society and I couldn't study it scientifically anymore, but we pressed on as best as we can. I finished my PhD looking at how and in what ways football hooliganism had emerged as a social problem from the 1880s through to the 1980s. So again, it reflected my own disposition to look at things processionally, but also that of the supervisor, who was very much into a process, historically informed developmental account of human relations. Crucially, though, the thing I learned from Eric was not only, the craft of doing sociology, but in addition to which, a sort of disposition, that is, that it's a vocation, that it's a commitment, that we should be modest over the claims we make about what we've achieved. So we can only ever have an approximation of the truth. And now you can ask me a question about this notion of truth in a moment. But furthermore, that we're a symptom of a beginning. And I think if we project forward to all the work I did in the following 30 years, I hope I've made a contribution, but I still think it's only a symptom of a beginning. And the work I started to do was at two main strands, as it turned out, but with no master plan. The first one, I continued the work on violence, on pain and injury. And I started to do work on that, which also surfaced in the sort of theoretical side, whereas Elias and Dunning are famous for the term quest for excitement. I tried to develop that a bit more and talked about a quest for exciting significance. And I thought that they had a relative blind spot to the symbolic interactionist existential phenomenological aspects of the sportive and human experience. So that was one way. But increasingly, I also was writing another tangent, which was on globalization, which reflects back into the biography of migration, national identity. And over the course of time, Toby, more and more people wanted me to talk about, write about, offered me invitations to the work on globalization and less on the body. I'm not sure whether they were telling me that the stuff I did on the body wasn't worthwhile, or whether that they were more interested in the stuff on globalization. So I became more and more linked to that, but I still, over the course of time, kept up a little bit dabbling in the stuff on the body over the last 30 odd years. So if you jump forward, I did work, to do with national identity and media, and our own work overlapped in that regard. I did work with regard to migration and continued to do looking at the flows of people, of technology, of ideology, of mediascapes, and so forth, which fitted in with that. And in terms of globalization, I tried to find a middle way between the different, the Fukuyama nonsense about the end of history on the one hand, and the extent to which, on the other, that it was an inexorable process of globalization which couldn't be resisted or which didn't have countervailing trends. And of course, the survival of the nation reminds us very much, of course, that the global is always contested in a variety of different ways, and that migration processes disrupt the narrative in particular ways as well.
There's a moment in the film of The Spy Who Came In From the Cold where Richard Burton is playing a man, playing at being a dipsomaniac, while also, of course, himself as an actor being a dipsomaniac, having dinner with Claire Bloom. And there's a conversation in which she asks him what he believes in, and he says things like, I believe that the number 88 will end up in Golders Green or whatever. And then he says, what do you believe in? And she says, well, history. He says, you're a bloody Marxist. So what's the relationship between the influences of Marxist understandings of social history that you had as an undergrad through to the Elias and Eric Dunning influences on history for you as a grad student, and then moving forward? In other words, a way of thinking about the relationship between the overlaps, the tensions, the differences applying to figurational or process sociology and Marxism?
That's a great question, Toby. And it actually goes back to the PhD days because in that period, and it's credit to Eric, because he said, find your own way, find your own path. And I did a lot of reading. Remember, this was the sort of period where the Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies, 79 onwards, and critical criminology in the UK was really accelerating in terms of whether it was Chaz Critcher and others. And how and in what ways I was trying to make sense of uh, the definition of football supporters, what was being defined as a social problem and by whom, inevitably raised questions of power, culture, and control. And of course, in that regard, the questions being asked by colleagues from a Marxist social history or from the Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies were exactly the same questions which we had to ask ourselves. And, I often relate back to the work, Folk Devils and Moral Panics. It's exactly the sort of issues which were at work in relation to the question of football hooliganism. What we wanted to examine, of course, is the roots of football hooliganism, and not solely how and in what ways it was being defined by the powerful, but also what were the underlying community structures and questions of masculine norms, which would give rise to a tough masculine style. And that actually was one of the crucial similarities and differences, and that those structural roots about masculinity, why it would be, and the uncomfortable message we had to give, they actually and still do enjoy to fight. There is a quest for exciting significance, in addition to which it also had a symbolic value, because the symbolic value was to be able to, in tough working class communities, to know how to look after yourself, and that whether it's machismo or masculine identity, that sense of toughness and an ability to look after yourself was highly prized and looked up to. And the uncomfortable message also was for women within those communities, some of whom will also be football hooligans, but not many, or at least not those in the really serious end of football hooliganism. They too gravitated to those males because they were safer. Now, that's not something which I would want and desire, but we were trying to capture things as they really. Now, I guess the difference, you might say, whether that's in the radical tradition, whether that's, different forms of feminism or of the Marxist scholarship and the process figurational sociology, always the debates has been about to what extent the task is not simply to understand the social world, but to change it. And therefore, that raises questions about intervention and raises questions about activism. And I think the debate got bogged down in that, rather than us actually as fellow travelers, if I could use that term, committed to a similar outcome, but actually the means by which we were seeking to achieve it was different. I guess I would say the path to hell is paved with good intentions, and that on the other hand, I can understand the critique which would bounce back and actually say, but that's an excuse for not doing anything. You must do something. You must intervene. You must make your voice count. We did actually, to some degree, try to do that in the project, and to a lesser degree over time. Perhaps I've become more recluse in that regard, I'll hold my hand up. But remember back, it was Mrs. Thatcher. She wanted to close sociology departments. And at the time, all we could seek to do in terms of policy outcomes was try to prevent them doing worse things rather than the things which would be desirable to do. So it was a delay on some of the madness they wanted to employ, because, of course, they regarded football fans as animals. They regarded the solution as locking them up. They regarded, and so though it was very much a policing draconian stance. And that, of course, was similar to how Stuart Hall and others saw, the way in which working class resistance through rituals was being dealt with in that period, and how the coal miners' strike of that period was also being dealt with by the police strategies which were adopted by the Thatcher governments.
So I think what you're saying is that, in a sense, it's a difference of inclination as much as anything. One inclination to 100% full-on resistance to the British state, the Marxist angle, and the other slightly more careful figurational approach that is trying to stem the tide.
Well, I think well, yes and no, because I know my fellow Marxist scholars would say that's a bit unfair to them. And they would say that we were as equally careful, and that we sought in the various campaigns with regard to the Hillsborough disaster, they sought to do exactly that and did achieve some good outcomes at the more recent times. So I think it's also, and here we come into how many angels are on pinhead territory, Toby. Of course, in terms of different forms of Marxism, whether you give primacy to the economic relative to the cultural. I mean, this is the debate within cultural studies, was it not? And remains so to the present day. To what extent are we dealing with structure and agency? To what extent are we dealing with matters concerning false consciousness? All that array of issues. And I think what process sociology differentiates from various Marxisms, and I'll try to be as careful with my words here as I can, because I know that I'm not going to be as careful as I sometimes am in print. But there, it's a question of, do we give primacy to a causal connection in advance, a priori? Or do we actually say that there may well be some elements, processes, forces at work which are relatively more powerful than others at that particular juncture, but it doesn't mean that it's always the case. Furthermore, in terms of whether it's a class gender analysis, the figurationalists talk about established and outsiders. They talk about the way in which we understand power relations in a more polymorphous manner. I'm not sure whether your listeners will fully appreciate the sort of subtle differences which would probably exist between you and I, Toby, but they're differences of a smaller magnitude than that between those and other scholarship and traditions.
Prof, we've got about 10 minutes left. And what I'd like to do, if that's okay, is to ask you a particular question of my own, yeah, but then leave a little time after you've answered for you to add anything you may wish, right? There might be topics we've touched on where you want to say something else, something additional, or you wish to retract something, who knows? But there might also be various domains that we haven't entered where you'd like to say something. Does that sound okay as a means of bringing things to a gentle conclusion?
Yes.
Great. So my question arises from my having read yesterday or the day before in the Graniad a story about there coming to be a national football league, as in US football game in Australia, which is set up, I think, for next year. And my immediate query was how much public money is being wasted on this nonsense?
Mhm.
What would your immediate question be?
Probably very similar because, of course, you've got a global sport power league in the sports medical industrial complex who are exploiting uh, people, whether within a society or between societies. So you've got commodity chains of different kinds. And the example you gave from Australia, I was thinking immediately as you said it, was, of course, you've got an American who owns Manchester United, Glazer, who's been joined by a man called Radcliffe, who, by the way, was a Brexiteer.
And doesn't pay taxes in Britain.
And doesn't pay taxes in Britain, but wants to leverage money from the UK Labour government in order to redevelop Old Trafford, which is the home ground of Manchester United. One shouldn't forget, however, that their city rivals, Manchester City, owned by an Arab consortium, okay, actually was once the Commonwealth Games stadium, which was funded by the British taxpayer, and they sold it at a pittance. So you often, and of course, North American listeners will know, of course, the whole issue of franchise relocation, city dollars, and so forth. So these things happen not only on the cartel-based NHL and NBA, but also happen in the Premier League or in the case, of the one you're talking about in Australia. I think actually, and in terms of globalization, the trend to track, and given the changing location of power from the West, even though, of course, you've got a backlash with Trump and so forth at work at the moment, and it's sort of 1920s sort of policies. The one to watch is not only whether you're going to have Pax Sinica in the 21st century, but actually the rise of India. And in particular, in certain sports, there's been a structural change in the balance of power in cricket. Now, listeners, again, may be less or more familiar with cricket. It was an imperial game. It developed out of England to the empire first and then the Commonwealth. It underwent a process of indigenization within India itself, gradual, slow, but inevitable. It's not dissimilar to, of course, that wonderful study Beyond the Boundary, C.L.R. James. And in this case, what's happened is that at a global level, the Indians have managed to outmaneuver Australia and England, which were the two traditional powerhouses of the game. And the model at work is what you have in India, which is a franchise model, not dissimilar to the North American models, but they're going global. So the Mumbai Indians actually are now, along with the Hyderabad team and so on and so forth, are buying up franchises in England in the 2020 series. And furthermore, for your listeners, the Indian diaspora, powered by global processes, powered by migratory patterns, are also within the context of the United States and Canada. And there, lo and behold, not only do you have the national team of Canada made up of the sons or daughters from the Indian subcontinent, but the Indian franchise teams are moving into the United States to set up a rival to, as they see it, the major leagues in the United States. So here, Toby, we're on the same wavelength, whether it's a cultural studies Marxist or a figurational interdependency. we see power, culture, and control at work in the sports medical industrial complex.
Beautifully put. I think the Groniad needed to interview you for this puff piece.
May I just tell a story of it's against myself and a very good friend of mine. I won't mention his name because I haven't asked for permission here. Um, I got a reporter, and they wanted to ask me questions about national identity, and it was the usual stuff. And I guess I was too busy marking or too busy doing something, and I didn't want to do the media interview. And I said, I'm really am not that much of an expert on it, but I know a man who is. And I mentioned this other person, um, who I can hint at. And actually, we've co-written a book on sport and social theory together. And he said, that's strange, the guy at the other end of the phone. And he said, that's strange because he recommended you. So that maybe the Guardian have got fed up with me over the years.
Wonderful, wonderful anecdote. I think I might be able to see the book you're referring to, but you wrote with this unnamed gentleman in the background. I think I bought a copy when it came out, Prof. So, to conclude matters, I wonder if, as I said, there are things you'd like to add or maybe even subtract from what we've discussed. Is there something we haven't touched on you want to raise? Is there something we have that you'd like to develop?
I guess going back to the present day, if I may, and I became an emeritus some 8 years ago. Continued to teach in Switzerland and in India, and will continue to do that for as long as they want me to, because I still like teaching. But in terms of the passion I have, it's for the research on the Irish-British relations, and I just let go with some passing thoughts on that, if I may, because I do think that those who talk about settler colonialism overlook Ireland, because when your language is stolen, when your identity is stolen, when your land is stolen, when your nation no longer belongs to you, what are the criteria by which settler colonialism is ticked? And in the research which myself and a colleague from the University of Ulster, Katie Liston, have done, we've tried to examine through the Olympic Games how and in what ways the British have sought to either deny Ireland its own name, two, about eligibility and jurisdiction, and three, one of the key people involved in this has been a man, or is now dead, but a man called Lord Burghley. For those of you who know the film Chariots of Fire, Lord Burghley, who refused, by the way, to be part of the film, but he's played by another actor. Sorry, he's played by an actor with a name similar to Lord Burghley. Burghley was a 1930s Olympian. He also actually, in 1948, was in charge of the London Olympic Games. And in addition to which, he was vice president of the IOC and president of the International Amateur Athletics Federation. And for a period of 50 years, he sought to deny Irish athletes the right to represent the nation they wanted to represent under the name they wanted to be called. And throughout that period, although we sometimes see sports officials as conservative, the people involved in the Irish Olympic Council and then the Olympic Council of Ireland sought and fought to actually change the name to Ireland, and in addition to which, that all of those who are born on the island of Ireland have the right to represent the nation, whether it's Great Britain at the Olympic Games, if they so wish, or Ireland. Now, the parallel I'll draw is that for the 2012 Olympic Games, Lord Burghley equaled Lord Coe. And similarly, what was at work was that the British still wanted wanted to deny aspects of what I've talked about and wanted to have the name of the team called Great Britain and Northern Ireland. It's never been called that. They entered as Great Britain back in the Victorian period, and they've remained Great Britain ever since, despite the statelet of Northern Ireland wanting to actually at various times seek to put that in. The final anecdote I'll give you, it's a lovely one, was from 1956. And in 1956, this will amaze your listeners, an Irishman won the what we would call the 1500 meters, a man called Ronnie Delaney. And as he was being presented his medal by the American president of the IOC at the time, who had various anti-Semitic and fascist dimensions to him, he actually noted that I'm presenting a medal to a man from Ireland, and gave the gold medal, but on the scoreboard in the jurisdiction of the International Amateur Athletics Federation stadium, it wasn't IRE, which would be short for the Olympic Designation of Ireland. It was EIR. They refused to actually allow Ireland in English. They wanted it to remain as EIR, era, in the Gaelic Gaelga. Not as a compliment, but in order to ensure that the jurisdiction would be restricted.
Good grief. These are weighty, weighty matters, and there can be no better example than the presence of the past in the present and the presence of the present in the past than colonial stories and situations. And it remains, as you say, a blind spot of a lot of criticisms of these matters to leave out Irish stories and the Irish conjunctures. So I think that that's a very telling tale. I think I'm right in saying he died in the last couple of years, and there were some obits that spoke about what an amazing person he was.
Burley died actually in the sort of mid-70s.
No, I meant Ronnie Delaney.
Oh, Ronnie Delaney. Well, we've actually interviewed him for our research. A very interesting guy. He shared various other anecdotes. You know, he was a very young man at the time, wasn't necessarily politically aware, but understood that there was an Englishman, Burley, who actually making his life a little uncomfortable. I should say, by the way, one final observation, if I may, over the crossover of settler colonialism. It's no surprise that the number of people in different Caribbean islands have Irish surnames. And why is that the case? Because the very plantation movement, which actually was stealing the land, was transporting Irish people to the Caribbean islands to have to work on those various plantations. And in fact, they were called white cargo. So there is an intersection between the studies which we know with regard to colonialism and empire of a more general kind and black ivory slave trade to the Caribbean. But there was also, they were not indentured labor, they were also slaves, white cargo. So you have these complex histories, and we should talk more about those and see to what degree our common stories overlap in those regards.
It's a wonderful point. Thank you so much, Joe, for this time together. It's been fantastic. As I indicated earlier, I always learn a lot from talking to you and from reading your work, and today's been no exception.
Lovely, Toby. It's been fantastic. We should meet up, and if I may say to your listeners, when next we do, we'll share a glass of wine or two.
At least.